Okay, this the title for our discussion tonight is "Leaning for All Four Cups, Not Two, Not Zero." You'll see exactly what that means, um, and why we titled it that way. Um, I was interested in a particular Gemara in Psachim, and I searched where it appeared in the Shilas and Shuvas, and it turned out to be in a Shilah Shuva called Beis Mordechai. Now, Beis Mordechai was a book of Responsa, a book of Shilas and Shuvas that I wasn't familiar with. And sure enough, it turns out that the author of this Sefer, Beis Mordechai, Beit Mordechai, was Rav Mordechai Fogelman, who I had known from reading Rav Lau, Rav Yisrael Meir Lau's autobiography. This is Rav Lau's uncle, who uh, raised once Rav Lau came to Israel, the old Rav Yisrael Meir Lau, when he came to Israel. So he basically grew up in the house of his uncle, the Fogelmans. And I think his brother did also, Rav Lau's brother also. So, and I was not familiar with him. He was the Rav of Kiryat Motzkin, and this particular piece actually comes in. I didn't realize it at first. It comes up in his section called Mechkarei Talmud, his Talmudic investigations. Now we'll see the piece inside, and at a certain point, I'll share in what direction he goes, and in what direction you'll find a very different set of material in an article by the Stipler. The Stipler is Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Kanievsky, who was from the town of Hornistipel in Eastern Europe. I think that's Ukraine. And this little town, Hornistipel, was the home of a Rebbe, very unique Rebbe called Rav Mordechai Dov Hornistipel, known as Rav Mottel Hornistipel, who is the great grandfather of the five Twersky brothers, Rav Abraham Twersky, Zichron Tzadik Livracha, Rav Avram Yeshua Eshel Twersky, and his brother should live be well, Rav Michal Twersky, and Rav Aaron Twersky. So that's Hornistipel. Now, so the Stipler was actually, though he was from Hasidic origins, he learned in Navardic, and he was a person that people came from all walks of life to consult with him. But his Sfarim, Kihilos Yaakov, are known to be masterpieces of lumdus, of conceptual learning. So what we'll have here is a tiny Gemara in Psachim, and how it goes off in two different directions. Okay, let's begin. Here's the piece. Now, we're gonna open up with a Gemara in Psachim Kuf Ches. I'm just going to enlarge it a little bit for those who are on small screens. Here's our Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Yain. Now this is talking about Haseba. It's a Gemara about leaning as we consume some of the food on Pesach night. So the Gemara says, Yain. What about wine? Itmar mishmei de Rav Nachman. It was stated in Rav Nachman's name, Tzorech Haseba. Ve'itmar mishmei de Rav Nachman, Ein Tzorech Haseba. In other words, there were two conflicting quotes of Rav Nachman, the Amora Rav Nachman, about whether there's a need for Haseba, for leaning as we drink the cups. Below pligi, they're not really arguing. Ha betrei betarte kase kamai, ha betarte kase batrei. One of the statements was talking about the first two cups, and one was talking about the last two cups. Now, however, Amri la lahaigisa, Amri la lahaigisa. There's some who say it one way, and there's some who say it another way. Amri la lahaigisa. There's some who say it in the following way: Trei kasi kamoi bau haseba. The first two cups of the Seder night. So the first cup is the cup that we drink over Kiddush, and the second cup is the cup that we drink at the very end of Magid, after we say the last bracha. After telling the whole story of the Exodus, but before we do Kadesh Orchatz Karpas Yachatz Magid Rachza Motzi Matzah, before we eat the matzah and the morah, etc., and then have the meal. Amri la. I lost my place. Amri la hagis, Amri la hagis. Amri la hagis. Trekas hikamai bo haseba. The first two cups require haseba. Dehashta hava kamatchala lacherus. The freedom is beginning in the first two cups. Now, this seems to be understanding the night of the Seder as an experience, and freedom is beginning because we're talking about the transition from slavery to freedom. So during Magid, that's what we talk about. Avadim ayinu lefarbo Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Vayotzienu Hashem, and Hashem took us out. So that's when we talk about freedom beginning, and that's when we lean. Trei kasi basroi lo bo haseba. But the last two cups don't require haseba. Mai dahava hava. The Gemara says something that I first found strange. What was. But the assumption of this approach is that haseba is leaning is for when we experience becoming free. And that's what haseba is connected with. But v'amri la lahaigisa, there's some who say the opposite. Adarab, on the contrary. Trei kasi basroi bo haseba. The last two cups require haseba. Hayishata dekahavya cherus. At that time when there is freedom, meaning there's a transition from slavery to freedom. But once the first two cups have been drunk, once Magid has taken place, and we have already spoken about the Jews leaving Egypt, well, then we're already free. And now that we're free, we can lean. So before it was the process, and now we're in the state. So, but the first two cups don't need haseba. We're still saying that we were slaves. So how can we both lean and say that we're slaves? Now the Gemara ends, and this is really what caught my curiosity and was the focus. Hashta de itmar hachi v'itmar hachi. Now that it has been stated one way, that you lean for the first two cups, v'itmar hachi, but it was also stated another way that we lean for the last two cups, idi ve'idi bo haseba. Both these and those, both the first two and the last two cups require leaning. And sure enough, that's the practical halacha as it appears in the Rif, the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch, and that's what everybody does. We lean for all four cups. Now, so there seems to be, the Gemara has two different approaches to what Rav Nachman was saying. Did Rav Nachman say that haseba is to be done when we're in the process of becoming free, or is haseba to be done after we're already free? That's those. Just a moment. That was an interesting. You hear me? Just confirming you hear me. Can somebody mention in the chat if you hear me? Yes. Okay. Great. So now the first approach is that we lean when we're in the process of becoming free, and the second is that we lean when we're already in the state of being free. Great. However, the Gemara says, listen, both were stated. And the Gemara doesn't come to a decision. It doesn't say, halacha, you lean on the first two, or halacha, you lean on the last two. It says, now that both have been stated, we do both. But both the first two and the last two require a seba. And that's exactly what universal practice is. Now, the Ran, the commentary of the Ran, in his commentary on the Rif, so he asks a very interesting kasha that got the attention of many. Says the Rif, Ve'afagav, those who are in Rabbi Hirschfeld's shield will remember that afagav is indicating a kasha in the Tosfos. So here, this is also the case. And even though de ba'alma kaimal anifcha dechol sveka d'rabbanan lekula, and even though in general we hold the opposite, that all doubts about rabbinic laws were lenient. Well, haseba is a rabbinic law. That's not a biblical law. It's not in the Chumash. Not like matzah on the night of Pesach or telling the story. It's a rabbinic addition, and obligatory but rabbinic. And we know that the rule of thumb that the rabbis created in their own halachas was sefseket rabbanan lekula, that when you're in doubt about a rabbinic law, so you can be lenient. Well, if that's the case, we really should say, since we're in doubt about whether there's a need for haseba, for leaning on the first two cups, and we're also in doubt about whether there's a need for leaning on the last two cups, so we should be lenient and not do haseba on any of the cups. So that's the question of the Ran. But his answer is, first he gives an extremely simple answer. Keva de lav milsa, but I will say it would be extremely unsatisfying to most people who are involved in conceptual Gemara learning. Hacha keva de lav milsa de trichahi avdina l'ravcha de milsa. Since it's not something that demands so much exertion, so much effort, so we do it in the best possible way. In other words, what's the big deal? So you lean all four. True, according this approach is saying yes. We would say sveka de rabbanan lekula. We really shouldn't do leaning, but because of it's not really such a big deal, we go beyond and we lean for all four. Velinera, but that's kach per shuzal. That's the way some explained, of blessed memory. But Velinera, says the Ran himself, this is the way that I explain it. You're forced to do haseba in all four, meaning it's not just an extra thing, a nice thing that because it's not such a big deal we do haseba on all of them, but rather we must do haseba on all of them. Because if we were to be lenient, well, here's our thought process. Amai nakil bahani tvei mihani. Why should we be more lenient on these, meaning the first two, than the last two? And vice versa. Why should we be lenient on the last two, not the first two? In other words, if you're going to tell me, okay, so do haseba on the first two and be lenient on the last two. Well, why not do haseba on the last two and be lenient on the first two? Well, you really have no reason to prefer one over the other. And maybe you're going to say, don't do haseba at all. Vinakil b'tavaru, if we were lenient on both of them, on both pairs, the first two cups and the last two cups, mitzvah haseba legaber. We would uproot the mitzvah of leaning totally. That's the problem. That's the way there is. So the Ran explains that even though in general we have a principle of sveka de rabbanan lekula, and theoretically we could either do the first two and be lenient on the last two, do the last two and be lenient on the first two, or do none and be lenient on both. Well, we can't do any of those options because we can't arbitrarily choose either the first or the second pair of cups because there's no reason to prefer one over the other. They're equally in doubt. And so why be makil here and machmir there and makil here and machmir there? And to be totally lenient on both and follow the rule of Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula both here and there, well, that you would end up uprooting Haseba totally. And that the Rabbanan, this is what I understand, the Rabbanan would have never said. Meaning the Rabbanan would have, who created the principle, Chazal who created the principle of Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula, they introduced into their halachas the Sveika clause, that whenever you're in doubt about a rabbinic law, these rabbinic laws that we're making, whenever you're in doubt, we're lenient, they would never have introduced a Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula when it would end up uprooting the halacha itself. So, if applying Sveika D'Rabbanan L'Kula would mean not doing to Haseba on wine, would mean never doing Haseba on wine, they would never have done such a thing. Okay, that's the Ran and his question and answer. Now the Ran, this particular halacha allows us to connect the Purim and Pesach. We have a very similar issue with regards to walled cities. The previous 2 weeks we talked about when you read Megillah in Hadassah and Karim, and that was an example of some of the neighborhoods of Jerusalem. Which neighborhoods of Jerusalem would have the status of samuch and nir'eh, adjacent to Jerusalem and seen with Jerusalem. But there are a group of other cities. Jerusalem is the only city which definitely reads on the 15th and not on the 14th. All the other cities, that's what I saw stated explicitly a number of times. All the other cities where the Megillah is read on the 15th, it's read on the 14th and the 15th. Now, the reason for that is doubt. And there's some doubt. For instance, Tiberia, there's a doubt about whether the Sea of Galilee, about whether the Kinneret counts as a wall. And that's what we discussed, is the issue of walled cities an issue of protection, or is it an issue of a status of having walls, being surrounded by walls? Chevron is an example. And in a number of these, there's questions about, was it walled at the time of Yoshua ben Nun? There's different sveikas that have different. Whatever the case is, so says the Ran in Megillah, ule'inyan ayaros hamasupakos, and with regards to the city where there's doubts, imheim mukafos chomim mimos Yoshua ben Nun olo, where there's doubts about whether it was surrounded by a wall, horu ageonim sheholchim bahen achrei rov ayaros, Sharuban Einon Mukafos Chomov, according to Rabbi Yodalin, they have this interesting ruling that they say that you follow the majority, and most cities are not walled cities, and they read on the 14th. That's number one. Ve'od ve'afilu tomar shu safek shalkul. Even if you say, well, listen, it's true that most of the cities are like that, and so then it would be natural to follow the majority and assume that this is these cities are part of the majority. However, even if you were to say that it is an even suffix, and there's really a 50-50 possibility, havale suffix shel divrei malakula. It's a doubt about a rabbinic law, and we're lenient. Nimtza, and therefore nimtza potro b'shneim. But then you would end up making them absolved from both. Uvato mimenu b'vadai mikra Megillah, and reading the Megillah would certainly be canceled then. Ulefikach korei barishon or patur b'sheni. Therefore, you read on the first, and you're patur on the second. Now, wait a second. Everything seemed to be very similar to the Haseba case. You have a doubt about a rabbinic law. Do you go this way or that way? Do you read on the 14th? Or you read on the 15th? If we were to apply the principle of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, we would end up, we can't arbitrarily prefer the 14th or the 15th, again, going on the approach that we ignore the Rove issue, saying it's a Safek Shakul, it's an equal doubt, 50-50. So you can't prefer the 14th or the 15th. If you say, well, be machmer on the 14th, well, why not be machmer on the 15th? And if you say that you apply the principle of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula for both, you just let the legal principles apply themselves. So you would say not to read the Megillah at all in those places, because on the 14th you're in doubt whether you should read. Well, be lenient. On the 15th you're in doubt whether you should read. Be lenient there also. So you would end up not reading at all. Now, but when it came to doing Haseba, so the Ran said because of that double doubt, we read on we do Haseba on all 4 cups. But when it comes to Mikra Megillah, the Ran here says, therefore, we would have expected to say, therefore, you should read on both days. But he doesn't say that. He said, Kore Barishon Upater B'Sheni. You read on the first day, on the 14th, and you're putter on the second day. That's what they said. Again, there's this is what the Ran says. Again, you'll find others who say differently, but this is what the Ran says. The Mishnah Lamelech explains the Ran, but then he said, but I have an issue with the Ran. This statement of the Ran. Because you can't apply the principle of when you're in doubt about a rabbinic law, you be lenient. Mishum because then you'd end up absolving him on both days. Uvatil memenu mikra megillah, and they'll end up not doing mikra megillah at all. Well, then we should obligate them in those doubtful cities to read both on the 14th and on the 15th. Why should you be more lenient on the 15th than you are on the 14th? And that's what the Ran in effect said, is you read on the 14th and you don't read on the 15th. Ve'aran atzmo, says the Mishnah Lamelech. Ve'aran atzmo. The Mishnah Lamelech is Rabbi Yehuda Rosenis, and he is a very important commentator on the Rambam and deals with many conceptual issues. And he writes very extensively. He's very marich sometimes, but I remember from my yeshiva days, he was always a very important commentator on conceptual issues. So Veharan atzmo beperak arvei psachim ala da'ud amrinon v'hashta yitmar hachi v'yitmar hachi. The Ran himself, when he talks about haseba, kulu tzricha haseba, he says that now that you're in doubt whether you have to do haseba on the first 2 or you have to do haseba on the last 2, you do haseba on all of them. You lean on all 4 cups. Well, he wrote, even though in general we hold the opposite, that when there's doubts about a rabbinic law, you're lenient. Here you have to do haseba in all 4. If you're lenient, why should you be lenient on these as opposed to those? If you're lenient on both, you will uproot the mitzvah of haseba totally. Kasav Haran b'Megillah hachinami gabi haseba havali lomar she'asa haseba b'trei kamoy dafka. If the Ran were to be consistent, he would say either both by Megillah and haseba, you should prefer the first. You should say do haseba on the first 2 cups, read on the 14th. He should have been consistent that way, or he should have been consistent like the Gemara in Kuf Ches. You do both. You should read on both the 14th and the 15th, just like you do haseba, both on the first 2 and the last 2 cups. So that's the problem. Just to summarize the problem before we read Rav Fogelman's resolution. There's 2 Gemaras. One says that on doubtful cities, one deals with doubtful cities about whether you do reading on the 14th or the 15th. doubtful cities, meaning there's a doubt whether the city was a walled city in the times of Yoshua ben Nun or not. And there's another doubt about whether you do haseba, whether you lean for the first 2 cups of wine or the last 2 cups of wine of the Seder. The Gemara says by Pesach, so it says to do haseba for all 4 cups. By the walled cities that are doubtful, actually it mentions a number of Amoraim who would read on both, on the 14th and the 15th, but there's a machlokas amongst the Rishonim whether those that read on both were reading it mitzad adin, in other words, and then it would be consistent, or they were reading it as a personal chumrah. But really, you really only have to read on the 14th. The Ran is taking the position that you only have to read it on the 14th. The only problem is the Ran is inconsistent. He seems to be inconsistent in how he deals with the problem that he raises. He raises a significant problem, which is we have 2 rabbinic laws. We have a doubt about rabbinic laws, yet we don't apply the principle of Sveika d'Rabbanan L'Kula. We don't apply the principle of when you're doubt about a rabbinic law, you're lenient. We see that even though we're in doubt about which of the 2 cups to do leaning on, we lean on all 4 cups. And even though we're in doubt about which day to read the Megillah on, we don't say don't read it all. But we end up saying read it on the 14th. The problem is, why not be consistent in both cases? That's the problem that the Mishnah Melech raises. The Rafogaman suggests the following: V'nira diyesh lechalek bein kishas safek ubetakanas chachamim de'az kidei lo te'aker takanasam tzarich lekayim b'chol ma de'efshar shetiknu kigom mitzvah saseba. When it comes to a takana being totally uprooted, well, then the takana of haseba on wine would be totally uprooted if we were to lean on we were to not lean neither on the first 2 or the last 2 cups. If the takana was really on the first 2, and we were lenient, we would miss it. And if it was really on the last 2 and we were lenient, we would miss it. So therefore, we do on all 4. Aval gabi Megillah, the takanas chachamim mekomam. If we were to say that if we were to be lenient, let's say, just on the last day, on the 15th, well, the takanas chachamim of reading the Megillah on the 14th in the open cities and on the 15th in the walled cities will not be uprooted. Rather, there's a couple cities where we have a doubt. There's a number of cities where we have a doubt on which day that you read. True, you don't apply Sveika d'Rabbanan to make them totally putter, to totally, that we don't do. However, b'kol makom hecha dekara b'yadalit, if you already read on the 14th, mahani taima de suffix shel derim lefotro mikriya b'tasvav, you read on the 14th because that's the first one you encounter. That's what he says. I'm adding that in parentheses, and then you end up being putter on the 15th. So that's his resolution of the Mishnah Melech's difficulty with the contradiction between 2 statements of the Ran. Okay. But he takes this whole topic in a different direction. He asks a very interesting question. If you look, or makes an interesting observation, the idea that you do haseba is clear, and if you look in the Yerushalmi, you won't find any doubt about when to do aseba, the first two or the last two cups. This is something that appears in the Talmud Bavli, and it appears in the second generation of the Amoraim, Rav Nachman. Now, what went on beforehand in Bavel? Good question. Historical question. What went on beforehand in Bavel? So he suggests that you had different practices going on. And you had some people who were doing, based on Rav Nachman, on their way of understanding Rav Nachman, there were some people who were doing aseba on the first two cups, and there's some who were doing aseba on the last two cups. However, and now I'm going to read inside, Aval das chachamim lo haysa nocha mizeh. The chachamim were uncomfortable with this. That's the best translation I would say. Is dasam lo haysa nocha. Ma heimra ubachach me'ein pirud hamevi lidei ribui kitos v'sios b'lashonom agudos agudos. They saw this a kind of divisiveness that brings towards different sects, different groups, different factions, different fragmentation. And in Chazal say on the pasuk lo tiskodadu, which has a number of different explanations of that term. But one of the terms that one of the ways that Chazal explained lo tiskodadu, the prohibition, is don't become agudos. Don't become different factions. We had it last week because when we talked about reading Megillah, where do you read Megillah in certain places? So I think it was Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin. He said, no matter what, wherever we're going to read it, we have to have everybody doing the same thing in a given neighborhood, because otherwise there's going to be a problem of lo tiskodadu in the same neighborhood. And then he went as far as saying that reading the Megillah could become a mitzvah abba ba'avera, which was a mitzvah which came about through doing an avera of lo tiskodadu. So he says the Chachamim, when they saw that there were different practices going on Haseba, some doing it on the first two and some doing it in the last two, they weren't comfortable with that because it seemed like an issue of lo tiskodadu. Again, it doesn't say clearly here. He's not saying clearly that it's an avera d'oraisa of lo tiskodadu. He said it seemed to be against the ruach. I think that's the way he's understanding it. It seemed to be against the ruach of lo tiskodadu. And he cites the Rambam, who says that even when it's a matter of different practices, different minhagim, we still have a problem of lo tiskodadu. So, according to him, the later Amoraim, Ravina and Rav Ashi, who are called Sofara, the end of halachic instructions, and he suggests a possibility that maybe this ruling was from the Saboraim, which is something that appears every now and then, but perhaps he says there is a goal of uniform practice. Now, for us, it doesn't sound like it sounds so unlikely because we're so used to multiple approaches: Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Hasidic minhagim, and Litvish minhagim, and within the Sephardi world and within the Ashkenazi world, different opinions going on. Whether it's the Moroccans, the Bavlis, and then there's the Yemenites who have their approaches, and so we're used to multiple approaches. However, his point is that in Chazal you see a megama, you see a goal of unifying practice, and he cites two things. Number one, there's a number of statements of Rav Papa who end up saying do it all. I'll give you two of the more well-known ones. What bracha do you make on the end of the Megillah? So one approach was Baruch Atah Hashem Anifra L'Yisrael Mikol Tzoreihem, and another one was Hakela Moshiach. And Rav Papa says Hilkach Lemrina B'Tarvayu. Wherever we say both, Hanifra Mikol Tzoreihem Hakela Moshiach, and that's what we end up doing. Monin D'Rabbanan. There are different approaches to what the text of Monin D'Rabbanan is. Monim Anachnu Lach Hashem Elokeinu, or Elokei Kol Basar Al Shanu, etc. Yotzreinu Yotzer Bereishis, Brachus Ve'odos L'Shimcha Agadol, Kein Techayenu Uskaimenu Uschanenu, and Rava says, therefore we say all of them. And sure enough, when you look at our Monim D'Rabbanan, it is a collection of all the different approaches that are mentioned. We follow Rav Papa. There's a similar thing with Birkos HaTorah. So, what bracha do you make on the Torah? Asher Kidsham Misusana Lachsot Beit B'Ivrei Torah, and Rabbi Yochanan says V'harevna, and Rav Huna says Asher Bachor Banu, and that's the greatest of the brachos. And the Rav Papa says, therefore we should say all of them. So we see there's a migama, there's a goal, there's an attempt of uniform practice, and he bases himself on a tshuva of Rav Haigon that about the different ways of different sounds we make on shofar blowing, and he suggested there were different practices of how to blow shofar, and there was, in the later Amoraim, there was a goal of uniform practice. So that's what he suggests. The problem that comes up with this, and again that's one of his the main parts of his presentation, that this is an example of that. But there are situations where we don't see that happening. Meaning, it's, for instance, when do you daven? Until when do you daven mincha? And when can you start davening Marav? So the Gemara has a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, and can you daven mincha until what we call plaga mincha, which is we'll call it a halachic hour and a quarter before sundown, or can you daven until sundown? And there's a corollary machlokas about when can you start davening Marav. Can you start davening Marav after Plaga Mincha, or is it only after nightfall? And the Gemara says, both are legitimate practices. You can do this way or you can do that way. Now that's against the approach of trying to create uniform practice. And there's a number of other cases, and you can see them in the Gilyoni Ashas. Also, Rabbi Yosef Engel's Sefer, he collects a number of these. So even though you do see Rav Papa in a number of places say all of them, as opposed to taking one of the opinions, and you do see in our Gemara of Dua Seba on all four cups, but it's not totally consistent. So that's why I had a little, and he mentions them also at the end. So that's something that it doesn't seem to be a grand theory. I will mention about Rav Papa. There is a famous vort that we say the 10 sons of Rav Papa at every siyum. Chanina Bar Papa, Rami Bar Papa, Achim Bar Papa, etc. So some say Rav Papa himself was always saying you should say all of them. Modin D'Rabbanan, different approaches, say all of them. Birkos HaTorah, say all of them. The bracha after the Megillah, say all of them. So similarly, we say all of the sons of Rav Papa. That's one of the things that they say. The Stipler has a whole different approach, and he connects this Ran with a big issue that comes up connected with that Gemara in about when to daven mincha, and that's the issue of when do we allow for contradictory piskei halacha, what we call tartidas asri. And he presents a whole machloket between the Meiri and the Rush about how to deal with tartidas asri. So the same Gemara plays very, very important in Rav Fogelman's more, I guess, mechkari, his historical approach, that there was this is part of a goal of uniform practice, and the Stipler sees this as a conceptual. He takes a conceptual approach to it, that this is a representative of how we deal with contradictory piskei halacha, and it involves a number of gemaras all over the place. So that's what I wanted to present tonight. The Gemara about Haseba, that we do Haseba on all 4 cups, not 2, because which 2 are you going to choose? The first 2, the last 2, but not 0, because we don't uproot Haseba entirely. We have a similar thing by the walled cities, where there's a doubt whether to read it on the 14th or the 15th. So we don't say don't read it at all, but we do say, according to the Ran, read it on the 14th. And even those who read it on the 15th, they read it on the 14th with a bracha and the 15th without a bracha. So that's the status. There's nowhere we don't say a bracha on both days. So Rav Fogelman sees the conclusion of our Gemara as part of a goal of creating uniform practice in halacha, and the Stipler sees it as a part of a meta issue of how do you deal with contradictory piskei halacha, and he has a number of conceptual approaches that he works with. That's what I wanted to share with you today, and wish everybody B'seros Tovos for all of Klal Yisrael, wherever they are. And God willing, next week will be our last Chabura before the Pesach break. I'm seriously thinking of doing the topic of Gebrachts, which is called Shruya in Hebrew, and to present this very interesting minhag, which is very, very widespread in quite a few circles, and very not widespread in other circles.